Good morning, everyone. This is the California Health Risk Assessment Guidance Changes webinar to discuss potential impacts on business. I'm James Westbrook, and I'm the president of Bluescape Environmental. I am joined today by Chuck Pomeroy, who is a partner with McKenna Long and Aldridge. We thank you all for attending today. Well, this is a developing story and one that's important for companies operating in California, planning to develop projects or install equipment. The Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or WEHA, has proposed changes to the Air Toxics Health Risk Assessment Guidance, the manual to account for new science on impacts to infants and children. Depending upon how these changes are implemented, especially for California air districts, calculated risk impacts for cancer could increase by 3 times or more. This could have a significant impact on business and cause the implementing agencies to rethink how HRAs are completed and to decide important items like the significant risk action thresholds. The goal for today's webinar is for you to understand how the changes could have an impact on your business and what your response should be. I will give you a brief technical background on the changes, and I'm very happy to have Chuck with us to fill you in on the regulatory and legal background that guides agency implementation. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about the Health Risk Assessment or HRA guidance changes and the potential business impacts. We're also going to discuss possible agency response under 4 different regulatory programs, and that's Air District Permitting or New Source Review, the California Environmental Quality Act or CEQA, the AB 2588 Air Toxics Hotspots Regulation, and also Proposition 65. At the end of the webinar, we will give you some recommendations and a summary of our presentation. Please feel free to use the webinar panel to send in questions. We will address questions at the end if we have time, or we'll follow up with you after the webinar. There is a lot of technical information in the guidance that is not covered today, so please feel free to call us, and we'll be more than happy to review your specific questions. So what's changed in the California HRA guidance? Well, as many of you know, the Air Toxics Hotspots Guidance Manual has been around for a while. The current manual was developed under the AB 2588 Air Toxic Hotspots Regulation that was formed in 1987. And also in response to the Children's Environmental Health Protection Act of 1999, certain technical information has been brought into the guidance manual. And I think our focus here is really looking at the children and how this is changing the guidance. What's happening is that there's now advanced science to protect infants and children, and this information is being recommended for use in health risk assessments. There have been 3 technical support documents, or TSDs, that have been adopted by WEHA and the Scientific Review Panel. That's the Non-Cancer Reference Exposure Levels document from 2008, the Cancer Potency Factors document from 2009, and Exposure Adjustment Factors document from 2012. So it's really important to understand that these are really not new regulations, just updates to the science. And also that these final documents, these technical support documents, have been approved. So now what's happening is the guidance manual is being changed, but the documents have already been approved that set forth a lot of the recommendations of the state of WEHA. Well, here's the HRA guidance manual update process so far. The draft guidance was originally released to the public in June 2014. There were public comments and workshops over an extended period. That period closed August 2014. WEHA responded to comments in September 2014. And finally, just this week, the updated draft guidance was released to the Scientific Review Panel. That was on October 14th. And you can go take a look at that current document and see the changes highlighted in there. That document will be discussed at the SRP meeting on November 12th, 2014. Well, what's going to happen from here? The future events are going to be the final adoption of the guidance manual. The state's going to have to update and release the Hotspots Analysis and Reporting Program, or the software that's used to do refined health risk assessment in California. And finally, California agencies will have to adopt the guidance manual. The guidance is just guidance, but the agencies will have to go forward and figure out how they want to respond to the changes. So yes, the guidance may be effective as early November 2014. However, because it will take some time for the agencies to look at how they're going to change regulations, policies, and their own guidance manuals, especially for the air districts, it could take some time, even possibly a few months or longer. In this table, I'm going to go through the most important changes that we're looking at, and I'm going to focus on the inhalation cancer risk calculations because these are where we're seeing the most significant changes that can have an impact on business. Inhalation cancer risk is the risk of getting cancer from inhalation of air toxic compounds. And so it involves things like exposure duration, breathing, the weight of an individual, and other factors. In this table, I'm going to talk about the most important recommendations that OEHA is providing. And you can always follow up with me on more detailed questions, but these are the things that we're looking at. For residential exposure duration, which is 70-year cancer risk, OEHA is recommending a lower or updated exposure duration. And this is actually going to help lower cancer risk calculation numbers. However, the main changes which are shown in orange here have to do with the sensitivity of children, as I said before. So there's something new called an age sensitivity factor. So before, where we had one age bin from 0 to 70 years, and that's really your adult residential exposure, we're now talking about 6 age bins, 6 groups of ages where exposure is addressed separately throughout the entire 70-year period. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the next two shown in orange, age sensitivity and breathing, in a couple more tables. But essentially, there are now 6 bins for age sensitivity that range from as high as 10 down to 1. And the breathing rate profiles for younger adults and children have to be considered in the 70-year calculation. The breathing rate, the percentile, has previously been recommended at the 95th percentile, but what agencies had done was they had adopted an 80th percentile interim measure, they called it, because the 95th percentile was so conservative. Well, OEHA is now recommending still the 95th percentile, and especially in the case of protecting children, to be conservative. That's the one that they are recommending be used. So that's a much more conservative or higher breathing rate by individuals of all ages. Now, one thing that also might help with risk assessment in terms of reducing calculations, the worker exposure duration, there is a recommendation to drop that to 25 years from 40 years. And in a lot of health risk assessments that are in commercial areas, the maximum exposed offsite worker can be the one that drives the health risk conclusions and determination. So I think in that respect, we will see an improvement in the risk numbers, lowering of risk numbers using that assumption. But the ones we're concerned about, of course, are the 70-year residential exposure. There's also the fraction of time at home is something that can be considered from 70 to 80% versus 100% of time at home. That's a possible assumption that can be used in risk assessment. And there are a number of other minor changes in the OEHA guidance manual that I'm not going to go through in detail, but just kind of read through them briefly. Uncertainty factors have been updated in some of the non-cancer reference exposure levels. There is now a guidance on worker concentration adjustments to account for how much workers are actually at a facility, at an offsite facility, as compared to the emissions occurring at the nearby facility, so an adjustment of that exposure concentration. The guidance manual does set out the AIRMOD model as the official model for conducting health risk assessment. That model has been used for some time, but this is now the official word that that's the model that they recommend. There are some other things like allowing for spatial risk averaging, among other changes. And so there are a number of things in here, but they're not nearly as important as the ones we're discussing here today. Age sensitivity factors is an important thing to look at. The age groups now are third trimester to 2 years, 2 years to 16 years, and either 16 years to 30 years or 70 years, depending upon how much exposure duration we're talking about over the lifetime of an adult. So what we're having to do here is take these factors for the overall 70-year period and apply them. If you apply a factor of 10 in the first 2 years, a factor of 3 in the next 14 years, and so forth, what happens is rather than have a 1.0 factor, you get about 1.7 times higher residential cancer risk just from the age sensitivity factor alone. These are the updated residential breathing rates that are in the OEHA guidance manual. And you can see here by age bin, the mean and the 95th percentile. At the bottom, the adult 80th interim breathing rate was 302 liters per kilogram day. Now, as you can see, if you're looking at 0 through 2 years of age, we're looking at 1,090, 2 through 9, 861. So as you apply these for different age groups throughout the 70-year or 30-year lifetime, depending upon the exposure duration, you're going to see quite a bit higher risk. If we apply the 95th percentile all the way through, it could be about 1.4 times higher. And again, this is just the inhalation cancer risk we're talking about in the breathing rates. So the adult 95th percentile of 393 is now much higher when you look at the weighted average across all these age bins. All right, so what are the potential business impacts? And this is going from the concept that because of these changes, the residential inhalation cancer risk will increase by up to 3 times higher or higher using the 70-year exposure 95th percentile breathing rate calculation. If we're talking about multi-pathway pollutants like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or metals, this could even be higher. We're not going to be talking about multi-pathway pollutants today, but this can come into play for some risk assessments. So what this means for air permits is potentially greater difficulty in getting the air permits. As everyone knows, when you go get permits or approvals, you're looking at some type of significance threshold. And in the state of California, the cancer risk threshold 10 to 1 million has been the standard bright line for some time. In the air district regulations, 10 to 1 million is often going to have to require some type of emission controls or toxics best available control technology, with the threshold of 1 in a million being the threshold without those controls. So this could lead to a project you have right now that might pass, might have outright permit denial because you cannot reach the threshold, you cannot stay below that threshold. With everything else being equal, with all these assumptions being used that I've mentioned. There may need to be project design change requirements, stack height changes, changes in the throughputs, changes that would require emissions to be lower. There may be operational constraints or limits placed. It's very common for limits to be placed in permits in California because of risk issues. We're seeing a lot of that on diesel engines and diesel-related equipment, and also other kinds of operations that have air toxics. Limits are very common when an applicant cannot stay below the significance thresholds. Finally, air emissions control installation as a way to get the permit may become more common to stay below the 10 1 million threshold. Additional impacts may be the need for more refined health risk assessments. The screening health risk assessment is an approach that is done differently in different parts of California. Different air districts have ways to look at the emissions and look at the air quality modeling and say, this is not going to be a problem. We don't have to do a refined analysis. But the refined analysis, which refines the assumptions, the modeling, and so forth, may become more necessary because of these changes. And that's going to require more time, more cost for consultants, more review fees by agencies, and ultimately can result in a longer time to get the permit and review delays. And that creates more uncertainty in how soon you can get your project. For California Environmental Quality Act projects, CEQA projects, oftentimes diesel engine emissions for construction and possibly for operation become an issue. And this can have an impact to construction project approval. These are emissions which may not be under the air permitting jurisdiction, but have some oversight from air districts. And it may become more difficult to get the approvals for development projects. Commercial buildings, freeways, you name it, anything that requires a piece of diesel-related equipment to construct the project. There can be more difficulties with approvals. The AB 2588 hotspots regulation requires facilities that are existing facilities to do risk assessments if their air toxic emissions are high enough, have a priority score high enough to create a need for doing the risk assessment. This is going to lead, if we look at the changes in the requirements, if we're looking at going to the higher assumptions, this could be a possibility that we're going to see a need for more risk notification and for risk reduction requirements. And where facilities have done risk assessments before, they may have to be reopened. A lot more facilities may be required to do AB 2588 health risk assessments. But as I mentioned, worker risk, this is the silver lining, could go down with 25-year exposure if that's adopted. Okay, what I'd like to do is talk about what's going on at the air district level. I'm going to talk about three air districts: the South Coast AQMD, the Bay Area Air District, and the San Joaquin Valley APCD. In the South Coast Air District, we have Rule 1401 and guidance documents that were developed for Rule 1401. And right now, there are changes in review. There's nothing that we've heard of that's coming up that's been scheduled as far as these changes go. But they are looking at the issue. So there was a presentation given to the governing board. I have a link down here below that discusses the potential changes. And so I would take a look at that link right there. The Bay Area Air Quality Management District has Regulation 2, Rule 5. And they have actually already adopted the residential ASFs that I discussed earlier in their regulations. So there are additional changes for breathing rates pending. And again, we've not heard of any scheduled activities related to these changes, but they do have the residential ASFs in there. And we have seen some fairly restrictive permit limitations in the permits as a result. The last one, the San Joaquin Valley, I would look to as a leader in the development implementation of these guidelines. I guess you could say a leader in this respect. They did have a public workshop on October 9th, 2014. The link is down here below, based upon a staff report that was written for the regulation. And in that staff report, one thing that's very important that they're looking at is possibly raising the risk significance thresholds. They're also looking at adopting some of the requirements or assumptions such as the 30-year exposure duration. They're considering going to an 80th percentile breathing rate for adults. And that is something which would, of course, lessen the impact of the risk, less than 3 times, but still would be conservative. So raising the thresholds, considering changes at the San Joaquin District, I would recommend everyone take a really close look at that and what they're doing there. And I think also if they're leading the way, some of the other air districts may be looking at what they're doing as well. It's important to consider that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn over to Chuck Pomeroy now, and I've got some questions down here below. What is the air district adoption process? What does he expect to happen? What kind of assumptions might be included in that adoption process? And is there going to be a change to the significance thresholds?
All right. Thank you, James. Just initially to talk about New Source Review and what's going on at the various districts. Each of the districts is charged with the obligation to adopt and incorporate the guidance requirements into its own programs. And this is all consistent with AB 2588, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But in reality, it's a standard rulemaking process with public comment and notice. And so there is an opportunity in each district, but it's a district by district process that will allow parties or interested parties to challenge or to provide comment with respect to what the district is doing. Now, this idea of significance thresholds, I think we can discuss that on moving on to the next slide. And it's this issue that kind of comes into play for purposes of all these 3 statutes or laws that are on the books. And I'll go through each one of them and you get an idea of how they play out. We probably should start in the middle. I'm going to start with AB 2588. I think that's probably the one that has got everybody's attention, and it relates to air emissions from existing facilities and operations, and it's certain types of air emissions that are listed for purposes of the law. And what is the law requires the establishment and determination of low, intermediate, and high priority facilities on a prioritization basis. Now, these numbers have been used historically using 1, 10, and 100, and it's kind of an interesting change that's happened over the years. The 1, 10, and 100 were originally established based on thresholds of 10 to the minus 5, 10 to the minus 4, and 10 to the minus 3. And over time, they've sort of morphed into 10 to the minus 6, 10 to the minus 5, and 10 to the minus 4. So basically gone tenfold more stringent. But the original prioritization guidelines, which are still applicable here from 1990, are less stringent than than where people have been measuring. Anyway, the prioritization scores are determined, and from those prioritization scores, which are all found on the California Air Resources Board site, determinations are made whether there's notice required to the communities, on whether there are risk reduction plans that have to be put into place for facilities. Under CEQA, again, we talk about significance thresholds, and CEQA is looking at exposures to air emissions. In particular, focus is on air toxics that would be deemed significant. The same significance thresholds that are considered for purposes of the hotspots regulation, which are again listed at CARB, are then applied on a district-by-district basis according to CEQA. Now, the interesting thing between New Source Review, hotspots, and CEQA is the fact that if you're dealing with just New Source Review, you may be applying only to the individual permit unit for risk evaluation. In hotspots, you're looking at the whole facility. And in CEQA, the most conservative, you're not only looking at the entire facility for air emissions, but you're also looking at vehicle emissions and road-related emissions associated with the project. So despite the fact that significance is the same static number, based on what emissions you're reviewing, you may end up having different things triggered under these three different laws. One thing I was going to mention, I think it's important for purposes of the CEQA evaluation, is the idea of construction under CEQA. One of the technical documents indicates that OHIA is recommending that for shorter term projects, such as ones where you're building a building or a facility, that the districts are to assume a 2-year exposure timeline and use slope factors and a 10-fold ASF to the assessment. Historically, parties have used a 1-year exposure rate over 70 years and are using a standard and are not applying any type of 10-fold or 10 times increase based on age-specific factors. So OHIA's recommendation for shorter term projects has the potential of triggering much more facilities being subject to more stringent requirements under CEQA, including the preparation of full environmental impact reports and additional mitigation and so on. The last thing I'm going to just mention briefly, and I'm going to have to tell you this is somewhat of a speculation at this time, but we've got Proposition 65 in here for the purpose of identifying something that may be an unintended consequence of this adoption of this statute or this guidance. Proposition 65 is a statute or a number of sections that require notice of certain listed cancer-causing chemicals to the public and individuals that are exposed to that to those chemicals. What may occur here is something that just wasn't considered. The guidance documents that are being prepared are far more stringent than the risk assessment evaluation that Proposition 65 has under its own regulations. It is possible that these new guidance documents may serve as the basis of challenges for inadequate notice to the public or to individuals from air emissions exposures using only the Proposition 65 risk evaluation process. It is quite possible that with the use of this guidance, you may be seeing more stringent or more extensive evaluation done by bounty hunters looking for parties that may not have adequately notified according to their calculations and evaluation. That's a speculation at the moment, but it is something that needs to be taken into consideration with the adoption of this guidance. James, that's just a quick summary.
A couple people have said that the slides are not advancing, and we're not seeing a problem on our end, so we do apologize if that's happening. Keep in mind that we will be posting the video for this presentation as well, so you'll have a chance to go back through if you didn't see the slides. We will be sending them out as well, so you'll be able to have slides and audio. And if anyone else is having a problem, please just go ahead and send me a question in the panel, let me know, or through the chat. Chuck, I think there's one question that before we get to the end of this here, everyone's really going to want to know, and I didn't touch on it, is what happens if what happens with grandfathering? Is there some way that your project could be reopened, it's finalized, you got your permit, your CEQA approval? Is there, what's going to happen with grandfathering? At what point do you see a reopening of risk assessment issues for projects?
All right. Well, I can answer it in two ways. One, if you're in the process of doing a risk assessment for AB 2588, according to the statute itself, you do not have to go back and redo it based on changes that are occurring right now to the regulations. So if you're in process, that risk assessment is not going to require starting from scratch and going all over again. With respect to CEQA, if you have all of your project approvals and it's gone through and it's a discretionary project that's been approved by the lead agency, then there is no need to go back and start all over again. You are effectively covered by your original permit. If, however, you do something that would be a significant modification to the original project, you delay the project to so long that you ultimately start all over again several years from now, where the original EIR could be stale. There are situations where these new regulations would then come into play for a project that might have otherwise been approved.
Okay, great. And on AB 2588, I was talking with Jane Lundquist at the Bay Area District, and she said basically the same thing, that if you have your permit in process, it's been issued, then you're fine. But she was concerned about AB 2588 in that really every facility has to be relooked at. And are you seeing a potential, I know we're speculating again, but do you see the state ARB changing the regulation for AB 2588 in the way that the air districts might be doing to relook at significance thresholds, or is it something more that would be implemented at the district level?
Well, fortunately, for the most part, the Air Resources Board has followed suggestions by the statute, which allowed the districts to make their own determinations on a district-by-district basis. And if you see the prioritization scores that exist today, you'd get a flavor that there are several districts sort of doing it their own way, and they're not exactly mirroring what the others are doing. And the example of the San Joaquin district seems to be a good one, as far as their proposal to change the threshold from a 10 to what would be equivalent of 24 in a million is, I think, a pretty good one. From what I saw of their evaluation, they calculated the risk. They had a low and high end of the risk in terms of a range. They picked the most conservative result in of that range, the lower end, and by multiplying 2.4 on the 10 of their risk range, they go up to 24 for a proposed risk. And their thinking is we aren't any riskier than we were before. In some ways, we're less risky because if we pick the low end of the range, there's certain situations that will be more conservative. But certainly, we're no worse than we were before, and we can make progress from that point. So they create a different trigger mechanism, a different significance threshold number, but effectively it has the same result as if they were doing the evaluation today.
Okay, great.
With a number of 10. Yeah.
Great. What I'd like to do is summarize the webinar now, give everyone else a chance to put in your questions in the panel, and we'll come back to those here in just a minute. I'm sure we'll have lots of great questions. So in summary, the HRA guidance may lead to significant impacts in cost of business. They could be substantial if there is no change in the way that things are implemented at the district level. And we do see the potential for that happening, but it's unknown what will happen at each district level as far as the decision process goes. Our recommendation is get your permit approvals now. There's uncertainty. So if you are concerned and you have a way to go ahead and get your approval under CEQA or under an air district permit, go ahead and get it now for AB 2588. You may be looking at some changes in the future. Just be aware that's going to happen. You can get involved. Now's the time to participate in proceedings. I know the San Joaquin Valley comment period is open. That's a great proving ground for some of these issues and concerns. I'd start there. I'd look to see what happens with other proceedings at South Coast Air District, Bay Area, Ventura, San Diego. They're all going to have them. They all have to respond somehow to this guidance. So get involved, plan for changes, build in feasibility review or what if analysis into your design. What we often do is we say, what's going to happen if something changes, or what happens if I change these assumptions in the risk assessment? If you're looking at a longer lead time project from now until next year, now is the time to be building in the what if. What if I have to increase my risk 3 times? What would I have to do? Raise a stack? Would I have to take some type of limit? Now's the time we can help you to take a look at that issue and do that what if analysis for your health risk assessment. You can consider using a refined health risk assessment to get approval, and this is something you're probably going to need a consultant to help you with. But know that the refined health risk assessment can lead to permitting delays. I often recommend applicants don't do the refined health risk assessment if they can get through with a screening approach. Much easier for the permit engineers to review and understand and go through. If you get into a refined health risk assessment, now that it has to go off to people within the agency that know how to review it, and that can cause delays. And finally, follow the developing story. There will be, of course, changes in what happens here at the different districts, and the schedule will depend upon how fast they move in the different processes, but this is definitely going to continue developing. All right, so let's go on to some more questions here. I've got a great question. I think this is for Chuck. This is a regulation that we didn't cover, and it's a good one here. The Air Resources Board air toxic control measures, especially the diesel ATCM. Will there be an impact to those regulations?
Possibly. It's possible. I know that the diesel particulate matter is a high priority. There have been efforts to isolate and identify risks specifically associated with DPM. It is possible, depending on where the rulemaking stands for any of the ATCMs, that something could be affected in midstream for the rulemaking itself. I think it does have an impact all across the board.
Okay. There's another question. Are gas-fired power plants going to be affected? I would say yes. If there's a permit process going forward for a gas-fired power plant, there may be some new plants being developed. They would be affected by this at the point that the guidance is implemented by an air district, because the air district would have the authority. And also in the CEQA process, if you're looking at construction emissions, you're looking at the, I think power plants, you probably have less construction emissions than larger commercial developments. You will see an impact on those projects. Gas-fired power plants typically don't have a problem with health risk assessment, though, when it comes to operations, because you're talking about clean gas, relatively clean compared to diesel and other fuels. So I've seen that those health risk assessments have passed fairly well at the 1 to 5 million, 5 and 1 million residential level. Of course, if you multiply 1 times 3, you're still under 10. You multiply 5 times 3, you're going to be over 10. So it really just depends upon where those thresholds are set. And but yes, they will be affected. Let's see. Chuck, do you expect any legal challenges to the air district setting of thresholds, implementing the guidance, and are these districts required to do CEQA EIRs for changes in regulations for this guidance?
All right. With respect to the guidance itself, every air district is going to go through a rulemaking. They're going to have to look at the potential impact, and the impact from a CEQA perspective would be dependent on whether they are in fact changing or affecting the results by increasing emissions. The argument that San Joaquin would provide, for example, for moving from 10 to 24 is the net effect is that it's not a change to current existing conditions and therefore would not be something subject to mitigation. So I'm not sure that CEQA is actually going to create a problem if they adopt things that will keep it consistent. To the extent that it's going to have, it's going to decrease emissions by adoption. I also think that that's going to be something that CEQA is not going to have is not going to be an easy road for challenge. On the public side of it, for purposes of challenging the regulations themselves, I think it's going to be case by case with each district in terms of how they approach it, and if they do the process adequately from a public notice and public comment, then it's possible that there may not be a lot of means to challenge these regulations, but it's going to be case by case. It's really hard to say at this point. Okay. What's going to fall out at each district.
Okay, great. Here's a question I'll take. What's the state's timing to release the HARP model with AirMod and other capabilities aligned with this new guidance? Can we presume the air districts will wait for a HARP update before imposing new guidance on NSR and CEQA permitting? The HARP model does already have AirMod capability with the on-ramp, but there are a number of changes that have to be done within the model. New tables, new relational data, and ways to calculate. It really is a significant change. And yes, what I'm hearing from the South Coast Air District is they really don't see releasing this until people have the tools to do the work. The truth is, a lot of these analyses for a single pollutant, you could do what's called a point estimate approach. I prefer that personally. You use a spreadsheet and you just calculate the risk. You do it with a formula. Really much easier than running the HARP model. Honestly, I try to avoid the HARP model whenever I can because it really complicates the analysis when we're talking about one pollutant. But if we're looking at multiple pollutants, like with a power plant, it's a helpful tool. And also from the district review standpoint, they may prefer to see that in the refined analysis. So yes, I feel that's going to happen. I don't know what the timing is. There's no firm date on that. It's a significant change enough that I would say, if anything, it's going to be a few months. And I think that's going to help drive the schedule here for when the districts finally adopt the guidance. When the HARP model is available, that may be the last piece of it. Another question on the South Coast districts, looking at CEQA within the South Coast and construction impacts. What are the changes going to be for construction health risk assessments? I think a lot of you know that construction impacts are often under a year, very short period of time, or a couple of years but most projects are a fairly short period. You have a lot of equipment in a short time. And so what has typically been done for construction impacts is to assume a much lower than 70-year exposure. You have a 1-year exposure, for example, versus 70. And so you can reduce your risk according to the very short duration of exposure. You take that 70-year cancer potency factor, you multiply by 1/70 from the model result. And so that's a typical approach. A more conservative approach that OEHA is recommending is to apply a 2-year factor, and if the construction goes more than 2 years, to account for the actual duration, 3 or 5 years. What's interesting about the changes with the ASF and the breathing rates is if you have a construction project, you have to assume that child is being exposed. And so because of that, for the first 2 years, you're looking at that 10 factor for ASF. This is something the air districts will have to address. Is it really fair to put that on the construction project when the construction emissions are going to go away? They're not going to be there for 68 years. Do you have to apply the higher child breathing rate and the higher ASF? Well, I can guarantee you what the districts will do is they'll protect the children, because that's the purpose of all this. So they will find a way to make that a conservative number. So that's why we see a lot of impact to construction projects in CEQA. And I'm not making this up. The South Coast District, in their document, which I gave you the link for, said that 6 or 8 out of 16 projects would have had to redo their cancer risk calculations. A lot of them would not pass. They would not have passed the thresholds for CEQA. And they've done some internal modeling, and they show, in fact, that many projects won't pass if they have to increase the exposure duration and the sensitivity factors for children. So that's a real important thing for everyone to look at. I think that, and of course, the NSR permitting, those are the two biggest issues we're looking at for approvals. Well, as I said, we're happy to have you today. If you have any questions, go ahead and send them to us or contact us. If you have anything else, there are a lot of technical details I did not go through, and I'm happy to discuss with you. I am in the process actually of developing some health risk training. I've done this in the past, and so stay tuned for more announcements on that. We put the contact information up here. I will be sending out slides and the video presentation. Yeah, hopefully the slides weren't stuck, so if they were on the video, you'll have them in hard copy form. And otherwise, I wish everyone a great day. Chuck, do you have any other comments or questions for today to send us off with?
Just thank you for attending, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.